I want to welcome everybody here and thank everybody for coming out and say happy birthday, Paul Buckmaster. So, well, you know, we're still gutted and sad, and we miss this guy, and we think he had so much more great work in him. What a shame, but what a body of work he's left behind. So, picked his birthday. Thought, I'm a fellow Gemini. I remember that. Oh, birthday, yeah, 13th. Yeah, that's good. Lucky 13. And so here we are, and thank you. And thank you, Paula Salvatore, the Queen of Capital, who was down for this from day one when I said, do you have Studio B, which was Paul's favorite room to do string overdubs in town, and do you have it on the 13th? And she said, yeah, I do. I said, would you put my name on it? We're going to do a little thing. And then A opened up, and here we are. So thank you, and to Bobby Marcus and Dan D'Souza and my pal Tim McDaniel, longtime friend, who introduced me to Paul some years ago. So quickly, this is the deal. We have a little video thing, not long, but just, you know, multimedia. We're working multimedia. So hope you enjoy it. And this mic is open, and we would like to invite anybody that wants to come up after our video presentation and say a funny story, a poignant story. We know that Paul was serious like a heart attack, but also was goofy as hell, and had a great sense of humor. And so, you know, it's nice to get together and let's see if we can, you know, relive some of those memories. If you want to, there's no pressure. We also have a video thing in the past. The whole family couldn't be here, which is unfortunate. Rosalie is here. Thank you, Rosalie. Lovely, lovely, lovely to have you here. And Banton is in the house, you'll see in a second. And Adrian's in New York, couldn't be here. The one thing that J. Peter Robinson, Paul's mate from Royal Academy, said to me, he was at a wedding in Chicago and miserable that he's not here. He said, look, mate, this is the thing I need to tell you. Remember, Paul hated fussy. So don't do fussy. So we hope that we've accomplished that, and we didn't do fussy. So thank you all for coming. Have a look.
Hello, friends. I would like to thank all of you for being present tonight to commemorate my dear father and your friend and brother in art, Paul. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it out myself, but I am present in heart and in mind. When Paul passed away suddenly last November, it came as a tremendous shock to all of us. I find myself struggling with grief, but I also noticed that I'm able to think of memories we shared together with much less sadness than before. I would like to thank everybody who came out to the funeral last November, but also everybody who couldn't make it, but showed love and support in other ways. Also, I would like to thank all of you artists and people in the music business who have collaborated with Paul over the years, as his music was so important to him. You have all contributed to or have been a part of the impressive legacy he leaves behind. Finally, I would like to specifically thank Tim McDaniel and Paul Broucek for seeing through and making sure that tonight's event is taking place. As Paul is smiling down from above upon us all, I send you my love, and I ask only that you make tonight a very special night. Thank you, my friends.
The next song we're going to do owes a great deal to the arrangement by Paul Buckmaster. The song is called 60 Years On.
At what point are you invited into a project?
Well, in the case, for example, of the first Elton John album, I was the arranger.
Walk me down to church when I'm 60 years of age, when the ragged dog they gave me has been 10 years in the grave.
I had to arrange for drums, bass, guitars, both acoustic and electric, percussion, as well as orchestral type instruments.
60 years on.
But when 16-track came in, I was only called in to do what Americans call sweetening, which I detest as a term, and I'm pigeonholed as a string arranger, which I am in part, but I'm an arranger, period.
forgetting, but these things I do. You see, I've forgotten if they're green or they're blue. Anyway, the thing is, what I really mean. Yours are the sweetest eyes I've ever seen.
So I think Steve Terrell, Steve, is very shy, as we know. But I asked him very kindly if he'd say a few words because we love Steve.
The first thing I want to say is thank you for this wonderful tribute to my dear friend. It's beyond belief. I mean, I didn't know what we were going to do, and this is so great. So thank you guys for coming, and thank you for doing this. I met Paul in 1972 when I was producing Blood, Sweat, and Tears. We all got together and said, what can we do that's different? There's this guy in England that's really writing some cool strings. Why don't we put some strings on a Blood, Sweat, and Tears record? So I said, well, who is it? His name is Buckmaster. So I used to call him Mr. Buckmaster. And I called Paul, and we went to England and tried it, and we met, and we became brothers. He was there for the birth of all my children. I brought him, all three of my children, I brought him to New York. We just became the dearest of friends. And then I would lose touch with him a little bit, and I remember there was a time when he was with Miles, I had lost where Paul was, and someone told me he was living with Miles. So the next time I went to New York, I tried to get Miles's number, and everyone said, man, you can't get Miles's number. I said, I can get Miles's number, I guarantee you. So I don't remember who told, Randy Brecker, somebody gave me the number, but made me swear on it, So I called Miles's house. He answers the phone, hello. I said, is Paul there, man? Who the hell is this? I said, this is Steve Tyrell. I want to talk to my friend Paul. Where'd you get this number, man? I said, Miles, you can be on this phone till the day you die, and I won't tell you who gave me this number. Let me talk to Paul. And he liked that, so we got together, And he came out to L.A. He worked in my studio. I remember when synths, for our samplers, just first were starting, Paul wrote everything, and conducted the orchestra. But there was a time when it got to be like economically kind of impossible to have 21 strings on every tune. So we invested in some samplers and synths, and Paul could make those things. He was the first guy that could make those things sound really like an orchestra. He'd play every note in there. And the thing that I finally remember the most about him is that when there was a session and he had to write the part, the arrangement and show up, he would spend more time trying to find the pencils, and the right paper. And I know what he was doing, man. He was just vamping to think of something to write. And he'd always show up at the last second, with the arrangement, right? And everybody would be, passing out. And I'm proud to say that my last album, which came out in April, was Paul's last arrangement. If you get a chance to check it out, the album's called A Song for You. It's on Warner Brothers, and just the same kind of thing. I asked him to write this arrangement. You know, the whole album was finished. I didn't want to bug him, you know. So finally I called. I said, man, I got to turn the album in, you know. You ever going to get around to this arrangement? I'll have it for you tomorrow, he said. And it was the day before he died. It was his last arrangement. And it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And it's I dedicated my album to Paul. And I could go on talking about him forever because I truly, truly loved him. He was my brother. And he's here tonight, I guarantee you. I feel him in my bones. If I could take my shirt off, you could see, I feel, what do you call it, goosebumps, you know. That's him trying to get out. So thank you all for coming and making such a wonderful tribute to such a great guy.
Okay, Steve has raised the bar, as I knew he would. So that was great, fantastic. I love the Miles story. I hadn't heard that. Sean, everyone, Sean Phillips, the incredible artist Sean Phillips.
Okay, you caught him. Steve got Paul when he was after he had first met Miles, but Paul told me a story. This is what happened. It's about 2:30 a.m. We're at Paul's house in London years ago, and everybody's so stoned we can't walk, and and the phone rings, and Paul picks up. He says, "Hello," and instantly he's bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. "Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, I can do that. Yes, sir. Yes. Thank you very much." Puts the phone down. Pete Robinson says, "Who was that, man?" Paul says, "It was Miles, man." And Robinson says, "Miles who?" Duh. Okay, well, anyway, what's he want? Well, he wants me to fly to get on the plane tomorrow at 12 o'clock and fly to New York and do some arrangements. Well, we better get your shit together then, hadn't we? So we got him together and we got him to Heathrow in time to catch the flight. 3 weeks passes. When he came back, this is the story he told. He gets through customs and immigration. He walks out there. There's a guy standing there with a sign, Paul Buckmaster, in full livery, and takes Paul to a stretch limo, puts him in, takes his bag, puts him in, takes him to Miles' house and puts his bag down in the middle of the living room floor and says, "Miles will be here in just a minute, man." Paul said he waited for 8.5 hours. Nothing in the room but furniture and plants. Finally, he hears the front door go, and Miles walks in, doesn't even say hello when he walks in. He looks at Paul as he walks through the room, and he goes, "Come in the kitchen." So Paul gets up and goes in the kitchen. Miles has a little brown paper bag in his hand. And he gets in the kitchen, and he takes this brown paper bag, and he dumps 2 ounces of pharmaceutical-grade cocaine onto the table and says to Paul, "Have some of that." And Paul says, "Oh, Mr. Davis, I smoke, but I don't really do that." And Miles immediately said, "That's cool, man. I understand." Went into the next room, brought out a manuscript, and opened it on the table to the first page, and points at it and said to Paul, "Arrange that." Paul, I mean, this guy is, Royal Academy of Music. You know his capabilities. He did not understand a single thing that was on that page. Not one thing. Not a single thing. And finally Miles said, "Oh, man, this means rallente. This means fortissimo. This means allegro. This means blah, 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 blah." Paul said in 7 minutes, he understood absolutely everything that was on that page. Because Miles was so brilliant, he had actually devised an entirely new method of notation for music. For music, not just his music, all music. But that was the story he told me.
You guys are going to make me do this every time, aren't you? So, we can't have an empty microphone. And I also wanted to make sure I thanked everybody who contributed all these wonderful images that we got, all the artwork that we got, the audio that we got. Susie Katayama, bless, thank you so much. You instigated this video piece that happened. We finally got it together so we could show it. Roxanne Seaman, thank you for all the stuff that you provided for us and the counseling and everybody. I know I'm forgetting people, but thank you. You know who you are. And it's all about Paul, and I continue to say happy birthday. And we have a cake. So at the end of this, if you haven't seen it, take a look at it before we stick a knife in it, because this beautiful artist did Madman Across the Water album cover, and it's over there. So who's next? Who's feeling talkative? Who's feeling? Okay,
Yeah, Todd, you got to work on that. My name is Michael Bradford. Some of you know me, some of you don't. That's the way it goes in this business. But more than 25 years ago, I think, I met Paul. But it starts before that, because first I used to live in Detroit. I worked for a singer named Anita Baker. It was pretty good, huh? She was really good. I was co-producing one of her records, and a fellow from California named Rick Knowles came and wrote a song for her. See, I tie this all together. Rick's here. There he is, just as tall and gorgeous as ever. But Rick wrote a song for Anita called Body and Soul, and it was a big song for her, and I decided to move to California. This really ends up being about Paul, so don't worry. I come to California and I call Rick and I say, is there anyone in California you can introduce me to so I can try to get some work? And he says, you should meet my manager, Tim McDaniel. So he says, go and see Tim. I call Tim. He says, yeah, you can come and see me. Tim's a very busy guy, But I go to see him, and he does the polite thing. He lets me sit and talk to him. But Tim was very distracted because, first of all, who's this guy from Detroit? And secondly, he's got 500 phone calls, and half of them are Matchbox 20 on the phone. So he says, he's tapping away at his computer, and it's not working. He's frustrated. I say, what's wrong? He says, my computer's not working. I said, can I take a look at it? And he says, what for? I said, well, I happen to know a little bit about computers. So I got it working for him, and then he gives me this reappraising look that people give you when they realize you might be useful after all. Tim became my first manager in California, and then he says, do you know who Paul Buckmaster is? And I say, God, everybody knows who Paul Buckmaster is. He says, how would you like to meet Paul Buckmaster? I said, I'd love to meet Paul Buckmaster. He says, great, his computer's broken too. If it gets me in the room to see Paul Buckmaster, I'll fix his computer, right? So I think, okay, now I'm Geek Squad for Los Angeles. But that's okay. At least I get to meet this guy. So I go to his house. Paul comes out, and everybody who knows Paul knows. There's the Italian side, there's the British side. The Italian side's very agitated. The British side goes, hello, Michael, come in, please. My computer's completely fraudulent. I don't know what's wrong with it. And so I start working on it. It's all MIDI, it's all this stuff. So we get it working. And next thing I know, he says, can you come back tomorrow? Can you come back the day after tomorrow and the week after? I become his composer's assistant. And that's my first real job in California. And because I was good with computers, because I was good with MIDI, was able to get the stuff working. He found that I worked with a lot of jazz artists. He liked jazz. We had stuff to talk about. He had a cat. My kids love cats. We went to his house. He made spaghetti. It was all wonderful. And we became friends. He'd call me on the phone. He'd tell me about maglev trains and about fission and fusion. And he'd talk for hours. And the very last thing I got in the email on October 17th of last year was some paintings that he had just done, some of which are on display in here. But he emailed them to me to see what I thought. Since I've met Paul, because of these people I've mentioned before, because of Rick, because of Mac, I've gotten to work with Madonna, I've gotten to work with Terrence Trent D'Arby, I've gotten to work with Richie Sambora, Kid Rock, all these people. I'm writing a musical right now with Dave Stewart from the Eurythmics. None of this would have happened if I hadn't learned all these arranging techniques, these composing techniques, all this stuff from Paul. And Paul wouldn't have done it unless he was such a great guy that was willing to take this guy from Detroit who could have just been sitting in the back fixing his computers. He saw something in me. He helped me develop it, and it turned into a lifetime of a career that I wouldn't have had if it wasn't for him. So Godspeed to Paul. I'm sure as they say in Ireland and other places, I'm sure his soul got to heaven a half an hour before the devil even knew he was dead. So God bless you, Paul. And thank you, guys.
Well, we know a lot about Paul, this very advanced musical theorist, and then we know Paul, the other side of him, which was a pop culture maven. And Paul, the Paul that I knew was always split between those two worlds. He came from the classical world, and I think he found his place in the world through pop music. So that's how I see the story of Paul's life. Our connection came with me. I was living in England. I was on Island Records. I'd been signed by Chris Blackwell, and I had a band called Automatic Man with Michael Shreve, who's the original drummer of Santana. And so we met because Paul was doing a project that Michael was also working on at the same time. We all kind of came to London and we dispersed. We had a band, but we recorded with all these other people. You know, just incredible group of artists to work with from the time we got there. He was doing a project with Stoma Yamashita, great Japanese percussionist, and Steve Winwood, and Klaus Schultz. And anyway, Paul was on that project. Paul and I met, and we did not work together. Okay, this is the thing I want to say. Like, throughout our whole relationship, Paul and I never worked together. But when I was in England, his family, his father and mother, took me in. They were my family in London. And so this went on for years. And so that's the Paul that I know. That's the Paul I know, working on so many projects, and our relationship was that of just kind of, fleshing out our philosophies about the world. He certainly was a citizen of the world. He had, very complex proclivities, but he really, really loved people. I think the thing that the dynamic that I experienced the most with Paul was about the source of his connection to what he did creatively, because he had reached a point in his life, maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, where he was questioning his spirituality, and so I sensed something occurring with Paul, and that is really that's the overview of the journey of our relationship. Concerts, weddings, births. My wife and son, now they think that the phone's going to ring and it's Paul on the phone, because he was, he's always been a part of our circle, and we had just wonderful conversations. As you know, he's a great conversationalist, and his tangential in the margins dialogue is really the stuff of legend. And that's it. That's what I like to share about Paul. There's so much more, but I just wanted to share that part of him. He had a great capacity to be intimate. I know he kept that veil around what he was sourcing at all times, but there was a part of him that really craved an intimacy, and I think that's the connection that he made with these beautiful pieces of music that he endeared to the world.
Why am I always shorter? Hi. Hey, I'm Bernie Taupin, and this is a tough gig to follow all these incredibly eloquent people. And I don't have any funny stories, but the one thing I have to say, and I think it's really important, and hopefully I'm speaking on behalf of Elton and myself, sitting in that room tonight with Greg Penny, playing back those tracks, we would never, ever have achieved the success that we did without those arrangements. I believe the songs were good, but they were made greater by his passion. And it's funny because when we started working with Paul, I was pretty naive, to say the least. And, I'd come up from the north of England, and I was a rural kid. Paul Buckmaster was like something out of the Three Musketeers. He was the most handsome guy I'd ever seen, and I'm as straight as the day is long. But he was so magnetic, and I remember, I'm sure he was into a lot of things that I wasn't into back then, and I remember being in the studio with him, and I would always sit in the back and not interfere with anything. And I would just watch him with all these incredibly, wonderful parchment, and I was fascinated by all that. But he'd go home at night and spill ink all over them, and then come in next morning, and they'd be all messed up. And, he'd sort of have to remember it and write them all again in the studio. But the thing that I remember the most about the way he worked with musicians was he spoke in colors. He would translate what he felt in his mind to these guys. He'd go up to, I don't know, a cellist or whatever they were at the time, and he'd go, I want this to sound like this. It's got it was all hand motions, and it was just, and it just blew my mind, and but really, it's wonderful to be able to be here tonight, and I remember him with so much great affection, and I know I'm not the last person he worked for, but, Steve Terrell always takes credit for everything, Is he still here? But he did, one of the last things that Paul did was to do I just executive produced an album of songs of Elton and I's called Restoration, which is all country artists doing our songs. Elton did his own album called Revamp, and one of the artists that performed on Restoration was Chris Stapleton, and we had him do a song of ours called I Want Love, which is one of my favorite songs Elton and I have ever written. And Chris Stapleton demanded that Paul Buckmaster do the arrangement on it. So I know that was one of the last things he did, and it's magnificent, and so was he, and thank you all for coming.
Oh, thank you, Bernie. That was special. Yeah, how do you top that? But there's so many good stories because Paul was so multidimensional. I try to have lunch with him at least once a year, and it wasn't enough. But you get busy in your life and career, and I would say regularly that after I had lunch with Paul, at least for 3 or 4 hours, I felt like my IQ increased by 10 points. Because Paul, like my father, at the dinner table when I was growing up, said, we talk about ideas, not people. We don't talk gossip, we talk about ideas. Big ideas. Big, big, big ideas. And it was overwhelming just to keep up with him. It's like, yeah, I'm here, I'm present, I'm present. I mean, you didn't just phone it in with Paul. You were present or you weren't in the room. So, and all of us that knew him in different ways knew that part of him. But he also was so kind and so wonderful and had a good sense of humor and liked to laugh at himself. And I think that's really key. Paul had a self-deprecating sense of humor, taking the piss. He'd do it first before you could do it to him. And I love that about him, to be so brilliant and also be so funny and kind of like, yeah, whatever, yeah, I did this stuff. But I'm proud of it, but I did this stuff. So I'm just killing time because somebody here wants to come up, and I don't want to put any pressure. I see some people in the back. I'm not going to name any names, but there's a tall guy back there that maybe wants to come up and say something, or Paul Salvatore, you want to, I mean, you're, she's the queen of Capitol. Oh, Rick Knowles. Okay. Oh, good. Okay, good. Thank you.
Paul and I we go back to 1976 in San Francisco together. And Greg and I go back a long ways. I met Paul Buckmaster in 1988. I was in England doing a record for a group called Then Jericho. And we were at a studio called Hook End Manor on the British countryside. And it was sort of an exotic thing. It was the early part of my career, and I just had a big record with Belinda Carlisle, and I thought, okay, what's the opposite that I can do? Is go work with a cool British band. And it was kind of like Simple Minds era, these kind of big grand bands. And we were out in this beautiful studio in the British countryside, and we had booked 6 weeks. And after a few weeks, I felt trapped out there, because I liked the band, but the lead singer was not a lot of fun to deal with. So, but the music was very big and majestic, and so I thought, well, we should get Paul Buckmaster to work on this. And I had no idea whether we could get him or not, so I made some calls, and somehow we got in touch with Paul. And Paul said he would do it, and I thought, whoa, Paul's going to do this record, unbelievable. So he came out to Hook End, and he listened to the songs, and we were talking, and I was so kind of lonely out there, because I was with this band, and when you do the 24/7 thing, and it was very difficult with this singer. So I said, Paul, can you hang out for another day and just like listen to stuff and we'll kind of talk about it? And then after the second day, Paul, can you just hang out for another day? We have really good food here. They have a cook. We got a nice room upstairs. Can you just hang out with us? Anyway, Paul ended up spending 4 days out there, just hanging out and talking about the music and talking to the lead singer. I sort of put him between us so he could sort of talk about pitch and things like that. Anyway, it was such a delight, and for me it was such an honor to get to know Paul. And then we went back to London, and Maria, my wife, and I, we had dinner at Spaghetti at his house. And he was telling me about Marseille, because we were going to go travel down to south of France, first time I'd ever been there. And he told me how wonderful Marseille was, because it was the gateway from Africa. So he said it's where European music and African music combined for this very special, magical type of music. So Marseille has always had a beautiful fascination in my mind. And then we got to go over to Abbey Road Studios, Studio 2, the Beatles room, and there's Paul with this is back when they had budgets and records, and we had a 25-piece orchestra, and there's the great Paul Buckmaster down there conducting. Amazing. And I was in this little room where the Beatles cut all their records, and I remember looking at the ceiling, and it was just that, what do you call it, the shitty clapboard or whatever they call it, with all the holes in it, hadn't been changed since the 60s, and I was thinking, imagine all the cigarette smoke that went soaked into those boards from the Beatles. And the room is very, very tiny. So it was just like, here I was, a young producer, in the room that the Beatles were in, watching Paul Buckmaster down in the room where the Beatles cut all their stuff, recording the orchestra, and the great Paul Buckmaster, who I had loved since 1970, since the first Elton John record came out. So it was a very heady experience. And, I love Paul. I miss him. I wish I would have spent more time with him. And it's an honor to be here, and I think we all love Paul, and he was a one and only, and a beautiful, beautiful soul, and a beautiful, beautiful musical mind.
Absolutely.
And here's the great Greg Penny, who mixed all these records. Greg's a beautiful producer, and he worked on a lot of the Elton John records.
I'm,
And I had had to talk him into coming up.
I'm in the midst of some of the people who have meant the most to me in my life tonight, and Paul was very much one of them. My favorite records were Elton's records, and my favorite songs were the songs that Elton and Bernie wrote together. And I had the opportunity in 1994 to do a record with Elton at Air Studios in London. And Bernie came, and the band, we did the album with Elton's band. And it was like the universe opened up for me. I had this incredible experience. They were so supportive of me as a producer, completely let me have my way with their what they were creating. They introduced me to incredible thoughts, and then halfway through the record, Steve Brown, who was working with Elton at the time and actually introduced Bernie and Elton, suggested that we bring Paul over from LA to do the rest of the album. And for me, that was like, I couldn't believe it. And I'm sitting in George Martin's studio with Elton and Bernie, and Paul Buckmaster is going to come and work with us. It was absolutely incredible. And from that moment on, my life changed. I just see things differently, and I miss Paul very much. I had a hard time the last couple of days revisiting the hours that I was able to spend with him, and we were very good friends, and I didn't see him nearly enough, like you said. But I would go hang out with him at his house, and we would talk on the phone all the time, and I miss him a lot. And in mixing a few of those tracks that we played in there tonight, like Friends, I hadn't gotten the multi-track out before, and last night I just had to solo all of his string arrangements and listen to him, and I felt like he was with me. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I thank all of you for being so warm to me. Thanks.
I am overwhelmed, and all you people are looking at me saying, go up. So here I am. I just want to thank you for taking the time to come out and make a tribute to Paul Buckmaster. You know, every time Tim McDaniel would call, I would get excited because Paul Buckmaster was going to come and work in his favorite room, Studio B. And I remember when we did the Train song, and I remember all my engineers coming out going, that's a really good song. You know, and I'm like, and then you hear it forever. So, and I just found out that he won a Grammy for that song. So I'm so pleased. And, you know, I kind of grew up on Elton John. I was a seamstress for the band. You know, that's what I did when I was like 16. So, and that's the only way I got into the music business, by sewing. So Elton John, Bernie Taupin, Paul Buckmaster, they've been part of my life. And to live with that and to be able to share this with all of you is just phenomenal. So thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for presenting Paul with this tribute to his life. Really appreciate it.
What's happening, everybody? My name is Marcus Miller, bass player. And I'll be quick, but when I was 19 years old, there's a New York contractor named Gene Bianco, and he was a big Italian mafia-looking dude. But he was a contractor of the day. He used to play harp, in fact. Anyway, Gene said he would call me for dates, Stanley Turrentine and Stanley Clark, Freddie Hubbard. And he says, I got a special one for you. It's Miles Davis, okay? And he said, you got to take this one, Marcus. I'm like, dude, are you trying to convince me to take a Miles Davis date? Miles had been, by the way, in retirement for like 5 or 6 years. We hadn't heard from him. I'm 19. As far as I was concerned, I didn't even know if he was alive. Okay, so what is this going to be? There's no way to prepare because Miles used to change his music every, 5 or 6 years. And he hadn't been playing, so I didn't know what to expect. I show up at the studio, and who's directing the session? This dude named Paul Buckmaster, right? And I'm like, well, that's the coolest ass name I ever heard, okay? And, you know, then I heard the accent, man. I'm from like Jamaica, Queens, so I never heard that English accent. I said, man, this is some official shit right here, you know? Marcus, I'd like to, well, wait, Marcus, is that my name now? Marcus. Anyway, Miles never showed up for the session, right? Which is not surprising. He had been in retirement. They were trying to cajole him into showing up, and they thought if they got Paul to come out and just start the session, maybe that would compel Miles to come out. Didn't work. A year later, I got another call. This one, it was Miles on the phone, and he said, I'm going to the studio. Can you be at Columbia Studios? And I said, when? He said, in 2 hours. So having experienced the thing the year before, I said, you going to be there? He said, yeah, motherfucker, I'm going to be there. You going to be there? I said, okay. This is really Miles this time, you know. Anyway, I showed up at the session, ended up playing with Miles on and off for 10 years. And moved to LA about 5 years after that. Does anybody remember the Source restaurant on Sunset Boulevard? Of course, right? So it was the health food joint, right? Right there on Sunset. And Paul's office for a long time was right next door to the Source. So I'd be there with my wife and our young children, and the Source was packed, and we'd go there for breakfast. Every once in a while, more than once in a while, Paul Buckmaster would come into the Source. Not to eat. He wouldn't sit down. He'd order. You know, it was his next door place, so it was like his kitchen. You know, he'd come, he'd see me, and anyone who ever played with Miles, you're a part of the family. So we didn't really have to develop a relationship. You know, you're in the family. It's like, hey, Marcus, this is your cousin. Well, you're automatically, you know, tight. Anyway, Paul would stand there and start talking about whatever was on his mind in the middle of the Source. And all of a sudden, everybody in the restaurant disappeared, and it was just Paul and my family. And it was so beautiful. You know how some people are they're really malleable. They can go into any situation and adjust to the vibe, right? Think, hey, I'm cool. You know, this is South Central LA. I'm good. This is Boston. I'm cool. Paul was deeper than that. Paul carried his vibe with him, right? And his vibe just happened to work everywhere. And it was really because he was so sincere. Like, you really wanted to make fun of him because he was so serious, but it was so deep and it's so real that you couldn't get yourself to make fun because you realized you were in the presence of the real thing. So anyway, Source, you know, rice pancakes and the syrup in my kids and Paul Buckmaster, that's a real memory for me. I'm not going to take a lot of time, but I just thought I'd say that for you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Saverio. I met Paul Buckmaster back in 1990. I just moved to the States at that time, and I'm from Rome, Italy. And a friend of mine said, there's a friend of mine that speaks Italian fluently and is a musician. Maybe you should meet him. I said, sure, let him come over, you know. I lived on this little flat in Laurel Canyon, and I had long hair. I played in a metal band. And here comes Paul Buckmaster. And Paul, I don't know how many of you know, spoke wonderfully Italian. He spoke perfectly. And it's amazing that, you know, he sat down there and he told me his story. You know, he told me that in 1945, after the ugly Second World War, his dad was a British army stationed in Naples, and his mom was a Neapolitan, and they fell in love. And so you have Paul Buckmaster, born, you know, off of this Neapolitan Italian, Southern Italian, fiery, and the British military. And since then, since that time in 1990, we became friends. And whenever Paul felt like speaking some Italian, you know, he would come over for dinner, and we'd make pasta, and we just talk philosophy, we talk astronomy, we talk politics. We talked until there was no wine in the bottles. And then eventually, years later, you know, I started working more and more in the international music industry, and eventually we finally got to work together with, you know, Susie Katayama and Bruce, and we did so many wonderful projects. And every time there was an Italian project, Paul would be so excited because he either would get to travel to Italy or back to London and make some music. And I think if, I mean, there's going to be memories forever that would be with me, just because so many years of just making music and eating pasta and drinking wine, and that was amazing. But, one thing that I can say, wars are the ugliest thing that the world has ever seen, but one thing that, that ugly war made is the fusion, the meeting of those souls that made these souls called Paul Buckmaster. And to this I say, salute, Paul.
Hi, I'm Greg Wells. I got to work with Paul right when George Bush was elected into office. Thank you. And, I'm a Canadian socialist, so we had a lot in common. And there's so many stories I want to tell. Hold on. I got to open with this one. So as soon as I got work as a record producer, I wanted to work with Paul, and got to in the early 2000s. It was really right around whenever W got into office, and we hit it off. And he heard me play a little bit of piano and realized that we could kind of speak the same language, and we just had a click and sort of a shorthand. But a repeating pattern would happen after every session I was lucky enough to do with Paul. We would have, at minimum, a 2-hour conversation after the session about the horrors of the Republican Party. And I noticed that every subsequent session, another 30 minutes would get added on. And it was the most electrifying, incredible conversation. No filler, all hard content and brilliant, and tons of lateral thinking and very open-minded. But the conversations were like getting over 3 hours. I mean, really, many of them out here in the hallway. And so it was 2005, and I was producing a young band called One Republic, and they had this song called Apologize. And I said we should hire Paul Buckmaster to do the strings on Apologize. So they didn't have much of a budget. It wound up becoming one of the biggest singles in the history of radio, but we didn't know that was going to happen. So he brought in 8 string players to my little drum room at my studio in Culver City. And I had warned the band, unless you want to really get into a long, deep conversation with Paul, when the session's over, don't bring up politics. If you want to go there, bring it up. But if you don't, and these guys were a lot younger than me, and they're like, okay, we won't bring it up. The session went great. Paul wrote the most beautiful chart. By the way, everyone thinks Timbaland produced that song, which is a nice problem to have. But the first version was the one we did at my studio, and then One Republic got dropped brilliantly by Columbia. Tim Devine, who I'm going to tell another story, but Tim Devine relating to Paul, which helped Paul win the Grammy for Drops of Jupiter. Tim Devine didn't like the new president of Columbia, so he quit. He said, I'm not going to answer to that guy. That new president lasted 10 months anyway. One Republic got dropped, Katy Perry got dropped, 50 Cent, Jonas Brothers, people that have made, I don't know, $1 billion probably for whatever record label they. So they were dropped, and I'm sorry, I'm getting all tangential. I've had 2 glasses of wine. One Republic signed to Timbaland's label after they got dropped. They got picked up by him. Timbaland released that song on his record. And then their original version came out too, and both versions became a hit. And Paul's string arrangement is just stunning on it. So anyway, the session went great. We were done, and I'm kind of looking at the band like, okay, just don't. Like, okay. And Paul said, thank you. We all said, thank you very much. And he left, and he walked down the hallway, and he made it to the end of my studio hallway. And then he stopped, and I heard him yell out, did you say the name of this band was One Republic? And I yelled out, yes! Just buckling in, you know? And he came back, and he just blocked the doorway of my control room. And it was 2.5 hours of like, America used to be a great republic, and it was the most, you know, he kind of schooled those guys. I'm sure they didn't know 1/10 of what he was saying, but it was this amazing history lesson, and, you know, far more than any of us bargained for, but it was amazing. It was classic Paul. Anyway, Duke Ellington said there's good music and then there's the other stuff, right? Paul, I'm probably going to start crying talking about this, but Paul is like on a very short list, at least that I found in my experience, of people who, like myself, have a big classical and jazz background, but also, for whatever dysfunctional reason, love the popular song. And I actually think the popular song is the hardest thing to get right. I think it's easier to be complicated. I think it's very hard to get something simple in a small frame at a level of excellence. It's almost impossible. I've definitely never done it, but it's the only thing that I chase. And Paul, you know, who could wipe the floor with all of us, with his little finger, with a little fingernail, loved a great song. He loved it. He loved it as deeply as I do. I've really only met a couple other people that fit that bill, like Burt Bacharach or Quincy Jones. They're, you know, deeply storied people who have marinated in the classics for decades. But I think it's important recognizing that Paul was really a master. You know, capital M, big capital M. He was a master. And he brought that authoritative, singular storytelling voice of his to any of us that were lucky enough to work with him. Back to Tim Devine, who is an A&R guy, classic, you know, sort of Spinal Tap, fantastic A&R guy. I don't know if this story is true, but I'm going to tell it because hardly anybody knows it. I'm pretty sure it is true. On the session of Drops of Jupiter, with Paul's incredible string arrangement, so the story goes, Tim was the A&R guy on that record, and Brendan O'Brien, super talented Brendan O'Brien, was producing the song. And Tim was begging for a rough mix. And the strings, they just finished the strings. So the strings were loud in the mix, right? Because we wanted to hear the strings. And Brendan's like, no, I don't ever give out a rough mix. Like, when I'm done, you'll get it. And Tim just applied all of his A&R charm to the assistant engineer outside of the earshot of Brendan and said, please, like, just burn me a CD, just burn me a CD. He got the CD. That mix is the mix that went to radio. With the strings like easily 10 dB louder than Brendan ever wanted them. And Brendan to this day is not happy about it. You know, because it wasn't his mix. It wasn't, but thank God that happened, right? That's all I've got. Anyway, thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Paul.
I hate speaking in front of people, so I'll make it quick. But I just want to tell a good little fun fact for those of you that don't know. But by the way, I'm Ann. I worked with Tim, so I worked with Paul for 12 years. Oh, God, I'm not a musician. I don't know how to do that. Okay, so a quick story about Paul. I'm sure, for those of you who don't know, Paul was obsessed with NASA and space, and anyone who knows him, we had endless conversations about that kind of stuff. But right after he passed away, Elon Musk launched his Tesla into space, and it has an eternal loop of Space Oddity playing on the car in space. And I just thought it was the most fitting end, I don't want to say end, but part of his legacy. It was an incredible part, and I just will always be sad that Paul was not around to know that. But how amazing for everybody else that's, I mean, you can't do anything more incredible than that. So I just want to share that for those who didn't know. So.
I know we could continue this forever, and we will continue this forever. I want to make sure that the Greg Penny 5-1 mixes of the Elton stuff, but Paul's music is fantastic. We had a sing-along. We recreated the Almost Famous scene on the bus for Tiny Dancer. At least I was singing along. It was it just me? Okay, yeah, there were other people, John. So I want to give us time to get back in there and play a few more things. If you haven't been in there, let's pack the place. Let's see how many people we can get into the Studio A control room. Sorry, Paula. We won't spill anything, but we're going to, like, how many people can you get in a Volkswagen Bug or a phone booth? And the only thing I want to say to you to close the night out is this is just the beginning. Paul Buckmaster's life, his work, who he was as a man, as a person, as a human being, as an incredible musician, and everything else that I'm forgetting, or I could go on. It's not me, but let's send out in the universe, somebody needs to write, some great rock journalist, Bill Flanagan, somebody needs to write Paul Buckmaster's biography, number one. Number two, I think that there needs to be a Paul Buckmaster Foundation of some kind. I don't know what it is, but I'm throwing it out to the room that there needs to be something, whether it's a scholarship fund for pop arrangers, whatever it needs to be, and it can be lots of things, but there should be a Paul Buckmaster Foundation of some kind. I love the Michael Kamen Foundation, and Paul, is such a big part of what's happened in the last 50 years in music that I'm throwing that out to the room and to the universe. And his artists, J. Peter Robinson, who couldn't be here and was tortured that he had to go to a wedding, or he was at a wedding in Chicago and was texting me all day long and just told me to say funny things and humorous and be irreverent and not be fussy. We should collect his art. I know there are more pieces out there. I'd like to scan them. I'd like to do a show and an installation, have that thing that's running in the side room with his interview, and do something. So let's continue the Paul Buckmaster party and continue this year and next year and every birthday as long as we're on the planet, because Paul, cheers to you. Cheers. Thank you.